Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 97th video in our Master Series and the 11th video in our backing tracks. This is actually backing tracks 2. So basically, what's going on that we're going to speak about next is bass. Bass can be a problem because most of the time, if you watch the last video, sometimes you've got bass off to one side or the other. So like if you're not just having a single track and you're going to make it a group, that the last video can kind of cover that if you're just not panning it somewhere in the stereo field. But you can also, if you're going to double the bass, there is a couple key issues that you really have to be careful with bass. The first thing about bass is you can muddy it up quick, just like a kick drum. The problem with is if you like double a track or you mic the kick drum to two different mics or something like that close up, and you're going to go do delay and detunings that we've talked about so far, and sound sculpting one a little bit different than the other, or it's captured from really two good really microphones, that the problem is it can cause mud really fast because there's a couple different situations. Even on a kick drum, you can pan a kick drum, double the track, or have it mic'd to two different microphones and knock it out 95 left, 95 right, and do all kinds of cool delays and detunings and all kinds of things, different sound sculpting on it to make it sound a little bit different, to make it sound just like some really bad, fat kick drum or something like that. And the bass can be the same way. But the problem is most of the time that in most productions that the bass is normally fairly centered. So you've got a couple problems. That if it's not like we talked about in the last video and panned off to one side or the other, or you haven't doubled it and panned it way off out right and left, and done some work on it because of something else, like if you got it panned, 85 right and 85 left, a double of the bass track to try to really fill out the bass, and it's got a lot of space that it can really boom because you've got like two or three different guitar parts and a keyboard. You got like a guitar part on the right and a keyboard on the left or something, you might have more stuff going on to where you can go ahead and let the bass, you can fill it out a lot more with that, because that other stuff will be much more upper frequency range stuff that'll fill in the spectrum that might be close to the same panning areas, but it won't override on top of it. Plus, it won't be sitting right next to the kick drum normally, because normally the kick drum is set for center. Now, you can do some of what I'm going to tell you about right now to the kick drum also. You just have to be real careful about phase issues and causing mud. And one big thing to get in your head is to really super be careful about reverberations with bass, because when we talk about on each one of the ends of the sub bass mix groups and on their the bus coming off of them, to put that preset we had saved to the set spatialization we had talked about, that it can cause mud, so you want to really be careful with it. So if you're not doing that with it, and you're not just making it center. Now, there's sometimes you can take the bass instead of a group that you've got it just panned a little bit left or a little bit right, with the kick drum panned a little bit left or a little bit right on the other side of it, which can work really great. You just want to make sure you get your snare out so it's out a little bit on the outside of the bass, and just be careful because of how much how much panning space multiples you have to work with, so you don't eat up all your space, so the rest of the band has no panning area to live in the stereo field. So, but other than that, really cool thing with the bass is if you're not just doing like we talked about in the last video, or you're not panning off a little bit right and leaving the kick a little bit left or something like that, 30 left, like 30% left or something like that, it's like left 30 or something like that, and the kick is on, right 30 or something like that, and you got the snare off a little bit farther than that before you hit the, the 50 right or left zone, that most of the other things will be out farther than that, that you can double it and put it inside there. So you can either double the track or have two different mics, miking the amplifier or whatever, or one's DI direct in and one's miking through the amplifier, and you've sculpted one to different than the other, so they both sound really good but a little bit different, like we've talked about. detune one from the other a little bit, and you might, put a little bit of delay on one. The thing is with the delay, be real careful when you're messing with delay. First of all, you have phase issues that are very hard to hear when you're dealing with bass. And since they're close together, like you might have a double track here, one of them 30 right and 30 left or something like that, or 40 right and 40 left, that the delay, when you start doing the delays like we talked about in those multiples and using those multiples like we talked about when we were talking about out front tracks, when you're doing with just two tracks like that, be real careful about phase issues and just be real cautious of that. The closer you get them together to center, that the more chance you have of having phase issues, and they're sometimes really hard to hear with the bass. But if you've got the kick like it's off, like it's like 30 left or something, or 20 left, or 30 left, and you got the snare that's 20 or 30 right, that you can really take the bass, double it, or have two different mic captures of it, sound scope the other one a little bit differently, and you can kick it out like left 40, left 40 and right 40. It's under 50, and so basically most other things are going to be out panned farther to really work with the stereo field. And it can really fatten up the sound a lot, because you basically, if you do the same work we talked about on having like, two tracks on out front vocal on out front tracks at the beginning of the subgroup mixing at this part of the series, that, it can really fatten up the sound and it can sound really cool. The biggest things you got to worry about when you start doing that is you really got to start thinking about the drums right now, because normally the bass a lot of times really works really closely with your kick drum and your snare a lot of times, because there's a lot of rhythm going on there, and the bass is playing either counterpoint to some of that and walking around it, or working directly with it to accent things that are happening with the snare and the kick drum. And so you really want to think about how that interplay is going to happen. And you might change the type of processing you do on different sections. You might do one thing on one section, or on another section you might do it a little bit differently because of how you want it to sound. I mean, once you get familiar with all the different techniques we've talked about, you can change up in a different section and be like, whoa, it changed up, or it was going like that, and then it's obvious something changed, but it's it's cool because they're doing this different chorus thing or verse thing happening, or this pre-bridge thing before the bridge, and that's really cool sounding. Does that make sense? So you can change it up in different sections, different movements and transitions and breaks during the production. But it's a really great technique to really fatten up the sound. What this normally does, this is really great for small bands that have, at least a keyboardist, that's pretty busy, and a guitarist that's pretty busy at the very least, that this can really help, that bass is going to really be working, on both sides, the right and the left, while that kick drum is like 30 right and, and the snare's 30 left or something like that. And it's out just a little bit farther, and it's doing interplay with those two, keeping the rhythm, but it's staying out of the wide stereo field of 50 right and 50 left. Everything else has gone to at least 50 right and left, or farther out as you set their multiples or where you want things in the stereo field, which causes a wider centeredness. So then you have, if you do that with the bass, and you've made it, you've decided to make it either like we talked about in the last video or something like this, that what happens is it gives a centered sound, so your kick and your snare and your bass are fairly centered. Does that make sense? And they're pretty centered, and they're not really messing with the really wide stereo field stuff, the stuff that's farther out in the field, like the guitar, the keyboard to be out there, and the vocalist out front, and it can also give the vocalist a little bit more space, because he might be centered a little bit more. If you've got him 50 right and 50 left, it's going to really, with that kind of situation, sometimes it makes it sound really centered. Does that make sense? Unless you've really done some unique processing like we talked about, in the out front tracks. And it can really fatten up your center. So instead of it being real dried, where you've panned the bass out to the left a little bit and the kick drum out to the right a little bit, and the snare, well, you've pan that off to the where the bass is a little bit, but it's kind of riding pretty close to each other, that this can really fatten out the centered part. Anything between 50 right and 50 left going in, that it fattens up that whole area. So, and you can throw the toms out a little bit farther if you want for accents, and maybe your floor tom is riding around in there also, so that it's kind of working in conjunction with your snare and your kick drum and the bass, and it really makes that you give that by making a subgroup out of your bass like this. If you really be careful about watching out for phase issues and watch out for reverb, because you get reverb problems with the bass, the whole thing will sound like a muddy mess. But sometimes it's cool because you can make it sound like a little bit of a wash back there, because it's not so defined and definitive like a thump bass. Thump, 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 thump. That you want pretty clear. If it's like doom, 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 something else going on there that's working in conjunction with something else that you don't really need to be that out front and clear, that it's basically kind of helping the drum set, work, keep some kind of rhythm going for, whatever else you got going on, that it's not as much concern for you. So it's more blending, that you can take that in consideration. But it's great because then you get this really fat centered sound, because as that bass is thumping along like at 40 right and 40 left, inside of the 50-50 range, that it's getting out of the way of your kick drum and your snare and maybe your floor tom, and giving them that really centered area with its anything from 0 to 30 right and left, and letting them interplay in there. Well, the bass is out a little bit farther, but it's it's adding a little bit more thickness to the bass end, so that the bass end is a little bit thicker. And if you do some of the processing like you talked about in the out front tracks on these two here, that it actually adds a nice texture to what's going on. Because sometimes bass is like, well, I don't add that much texture to my bass, and it's like, well, if you really experiment with it, you will be surprised that the one, you got the one on the right and one on the left, they sound a little bit different. One is detuned a little bit of delay on one from the other, using the multiples we talked about, and it's got this really nice fat sound, but it's not wide stereo. And that way, anything else 50 or out farther, it's really not messing with the stereo, where that's at in the stereo field, and it's not really trampling along on the bait where the kick drum is and the snare drum and maybe the floor tom. It's not getting inside of their space either. And it's a really cool technique to really fatten up your centeredness if you decide to take your bass and do a little bit, either some of the processing like we talked about in the last video, or doing something like this. And it can really fatten up the centered sound without, and still get out of the way of your drum kit. So, and just be real careful of phase and reverberations causing a mud. So, besides that, the only thing before the end of this video is panning it way out. You can also pan the bass way out if you make it a subgroup. That sometimes I normally don't pan anything all the way out right and left, but sometimes if you keep everything else inside of like 95 right and left, and it's inside the stereo field, and you kick that bass drum all the way out right and left, it really has a cool effect, because you do all that processing like we talked about. And if your bass is really centered on the production, that and the kick drum, you might have the kick drum just centered, and you might have the bass all the way out there. So you are really filling out the stereo field with the bass, thump, thump, bam, bam, and the kick drum, thump, thump, bam, bam, thump, bam, bam. You get this really full sounding low end that's just monstrous, they just really come at you in your face, where everything else is wide in the stereo field, but inside of there. Does that make sense? So those are those are a couple really cool techniques to really help you. And like I said, you can change that up sometimes, and it can be just a cool effect. All of a sudden, you flip that around doing some of those different techniques at a certain movement or break in your song, and it can have a really cool effect. It's just like, whoa, what happened there? Yeah, bam, bam, and then back to the verse or something, And so that's a really another cool technique. And we're dealing with the bass. Bass is normally a pretty simple concept, unless we're talking about symphonic bass, which we will talk about a little bit later when we get into a subgroup that's something like, a bunch of contrabasses. So, peace, soap, love. I hope you enjoyed this video. I kind of cut it short because I ran out of time, and I was talking about some other thing when I ran out of time. I just wanted to say, be real careful of phase issues, and be real careful of too much reverb in your low end, because it can cause mud in a hurry. Other than that, I hope that helps a lot, and that's another way to run your subgroups when you're dealing with bass. The last video and this video to really help you kind of fatten up your sound a little bit. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video on our subgroup mixing, and I'll see you in the next video.